Thanks so much, Almandina, and welcome to our audience today. I am delighted to say that I've got certainly one of the hot topics for discussion in our panel discussion today. Um, Not least because of the relative turbulence that we've all endured over the last couple of years, but really a great opportunity to be joined by my fellow panelists to talk about what the future holds. And talking of those panelists, I'll do a quick introduction, and then we can get into the meat of the discussion. But I'd like to introduce three members, all coming from different industries and forums, so different views and perspectives, which I'm delighted about. First, I'm delighted to be joined by Brett Hudson, Global Head of Ethics, Risk, Compliance Strategy and Innovation at Corporate Functions from Novartis. So Brett, thank you so much for joining us today. Just a brief word of Brett's industry experience. He is joining us from Switzerland today, but has a path and career that has worked across Australia, Thailand, and Germany to find us with us today. So, Brett, thank you so much for joining us. I also like to introduce Siddhartha Dash, or Sid, a research director at Charters Research, focusing on the financial and energy sector. Again, Sid joins us with 20 plus years experience in risk management and software perspective. So Sid, very, very warm welcome, and obviously a fellow Londoner on that side. And last but definitely not least, given the man who's definitely got the early call for the day, I'm delighted that we're joined by Garrett Smiley from the other side of the Atlantic. Garrett is CISO and VP of Information Security at Serco. Board member experience across various operations. Garrett provides us a wealth of knowledge in the industry to round out what I think will be a very interesting discussion. So to kick off where we're starting, I mentioned already in the opening around the last 18, 20 months being such a turbulent and eventful period of time for all of us, personal, business, and anything in between. But one of the things we want to focus on today is that in the acronym of GRC, the governance, risk, and compliance side of things, has been materially impacted on pretty much every level. And now, as we speak to our customers, there is a heightened board focus on the type of areas that we are going to touch upon today in some level, but particularly around cyber and things around the diversity of organizations, but also a hot topic for the duration of the summit around ESG. Now, I'd love to move us through this discussion towards what that looks like from all of your perspectives, but for right now, I think it's a good starting point to say, okay, that's 2 years have evolved, and what was now look like 2021 shaped from that experience. And perhaps if we can lead into that conversation, I could turn that question over to you, Brett, in terms of what does now look like in the context of all that change before we step onto, so what does the future look like?
Yeah, sure. Look, first, thank you so much for the opportunity to be a part of the panel today. It's great to be able to join and to share some perspective with other thought leaders on this topic. Look, I think, if anything, the last 18 to 24 months has taught us, particularly for organizations like ours, it's shown us that we really need to have good, robust enterprise risk management frameworks in place. If you look at how quickly the pace of change has happened, particularly during the pandemic, COVID-19, without having a good, solid, robust enterprise risk management framework, it would have been very difficult for organizations to continuously monitor and assess the impact that this has had on organizations' risk portfolio, and giving the ability to slightly adjust focus as it was needed. I think definitely what we've seen, given the pace of change, is cybersecurity is definitely one of the key risks for all organizations that they're continuously trying to navigate. and think how best to handle if and when it happens, because the likelihood that it will happen is definitely there. But also, in addition to cybersecurity, which has kind of been increased based on new ways of working, the risk, particularly related to ESG and third-party risk management, has also elevated. And I guess some of the questions that come up for us as organization is just this overlap between the governance within ESG and the governance within GRC, and how organizations make sure they have the right approach to governance within their organization. So maybe this is just a couple of areas as thought starters to kick off the discussion.
Excellent and great starting point, Brett. Thank you for that. I think if we touch upon the theme there around the cyber side of things, and I don't need to point towards the expert in the room, but Garrett, from your experience to date, what has that looked like for you as an organisation, and I suppose a personal contributor towards keeping Serco safe, as it were?
Well, I think the thing with GRC in general, as it intersects with me and in my discipline, is that it's table stakes, and it's becoming more and more so table stakes to do GRC against well-defined frameworks and control sets. And this has been the case for a while, but in my particular industry, which is professional services focused on a government customer, they are becoming much more savvy in regards to what they should be requiring. And in my neck of the woods, the enforcement, if you will, is being done through the contractual cudgel. So, whereas in other industries, say, for example, finance, regulation is going to have play a great part. That doesn't play as great a part for me as it does the customers requiring this contractually, therefore you have to deliver it. So to that end, what I am seeing, and I'm seeing this across all regions in our company, we're an international organization headquartered in the UK. And obviously I work stateside. I am seeing it here in the US. I am seeing it in the UK. I'm also seeing it in ASPAC, seeing it across the globe. And basically the government customers are saying, here are the frameworks and the control sets that we want you to be compliant to. We are going to require this contractually in order for you to even be able to bid on work, not just do the work, but even get to play in the playground, so to speak. And if you don't have this, then you're not going to be a supplier to us, period, end of story. And there's various approaches on that. I can say here in the States, because I work for a federal contractor, one of the biggest things that has kind of taken all the oxygen in the room for us has been a cybersecurity maturity model framework and associated certification by an external third-party entity. And that is what we are driving for. And it's a massive sea change, because never before have we been required as a federal contractor to have that in place, to have an external third party audit us rigorously against maturity, not just a snapshot in time, but maturity on process, making sure that everything we do is done in a reasonably secure and safe manner. And I'm seeing this take hold across the globe. So as it relates to GRC, this is not just where we're at now, but it's where we're, looking into not too distant future on as well. So as the expression goes, the future is now.
Absolutely. Interesting to pick up on 2 points. I'm going to come back to maturity, because I think it's an interesting segue to future context in terms of so what's now look like and what does maturing look like. So I'll open that back up. But very interesting from your perspective, Garrett, is that that almost dictatorial client-led I know it's government-led, but client-led enforcement. You must. That's it. You must. But Sid, I would like to touch this with you and kind of bring it into what you're seeing from the industries you're close to from a chartist perspective. Is how's the evolution looking from your side? I mean, that's a very dictatorial point of view, but what themes have you seen over the last 18, 20 months in terms of the maturity of regulation in the markets that you observe?
I think we see a slightly more complicated picture in, say, the energy and finance industries, which we look at. Obviously, the last 18 months, 24 months has shown all financial institutions and to a large extent energy organizations that the IT infrastructure is the core infrastructure that any organization runs on. And equally, we see a very strong, both of these industries are highly regulated, and we see a very strong regulatory push on operational and IT resilience. However, the push hasn't been, there are specific regulations. You can see some of them from BOE, you can see some of them from EBA. There's also a relative maturity of some of these regulations. You can see some of these regulations on third party from EBA are more mature. Some of them on the operational resilience side are more mature for BOE and so on. So, however, we think that it's a regulation plus effort, if you will. So, what we are seeing is a lot more, a lot of the regulators pushing very strongly for a well-defined perspective on operational resilience, pushing for a well-defined perspective on how you manage third parties and how you manage third parties in your IT infrastructure. However, we have seen the evolution of a single standard has probably been little slower than some other industries. I guess there is a sense that IT risk needs to evolve in itself as a discipline, and there will be many approaches by many different institutions, and regulators will pick up best practice and codify them as things move. So what we are seeing is a little bit of an iterative formation of regulation. One thing we can be sure, the regulatory framework that is today is different from what it was 18 months ago, both implicit and explicit. And we'll see a massive shift in the next 3-4 years. We can see that direction. Directionally, the model is clear. Whereas what I would say is that we also can be almost guaranteed that there will be iterative changes as the regulators themselves figure out what is the best practice, what is the best ways of quantifying, analyzing, thinking about limits, constraints, structures around, and must-haves that you have to place in operational resilience and from an IT resilience and IT risk standpoint. So what we are seeing is what I would say almost continuously evolving set of criteria, and to that extent, more how would I say a more less structured than I think what Garrett was talking about, but no less impactful. I mean, in the sense, most financial institutions have made a pretty structural shift in the way they think about GRC, the way they think about third-party risk, and the way they think about IT risk and its analysis. That has shifted substantially. So, yeah, we do see a structural, ongoing but somewhat iterative shift, if you will.
So I suppose to paraphrase that softer approach is a more sequential approach, whereas obviously Garrett is experiencing far more a black and white shift. You also mentioned that kind of maturity theme, which is a nice segue to bring me back to Brett, and I suppose where we're looking more into the future now, and whether it's your observation market-wide, looking at the pharmaceutical organizations at large, but your personal experience within Novartis. The thing about the top of mind, and whilst am keen to explore the thoughts towards what that means for ESG. I'm also conscious that it is not the only part of the future. There is other parts. So maybe in context of the bigger movers, for the next 12 to 24 months, from your perspective, what does that look like?
Yeah, look, I think Gareth also touched on this. Third-party risk management remains a key area of focus for us. Like with all of the changes in regulations across all the different risk areas within an organization, we've seen the third-party risk management framework, particularly the due diligence process, become more robust and more complex. And this has a certain impact also on potential suppliers in which you want to engage. And so if you look at the amount of suppliers that an organization of this size would engage, there's going to be certain situations where some of these smaller suppliers and who you need to engage with and work with just don't have the ability all the times to meet the expectation that you have. And so even when you think about how the third-party risk management framework will change, it's becoming more of a external supplier engagement strategy that you need to have, where you need to not only assess, but you probably need to partner a lot more with some of these third parties to help them get to the level of increased expectation that companies will have, particularly in some of these areas which we just touched on, cybersecurity and IT. And so one of the key areas of focus for us is definitely third-party risk management. And in addition to that, how we continue to leverage technology, which is closely linked, to further advance our program and make sure that we automate a lot of these processes so that we can move faster. But these are kind of linked together as well, because then lots of new third-party suppliers, particularly in the digital space, come into play. And the tendency is to move quick. So how does a third-party risk management framework allow you to do that, given that it continues to increase in terms of complexity?
Thanks for that, Brett. I just taking some notes as you're talking there, because that interconnectedness, I think, is a key linchpin. Because I've noted under maturity that we're not talking about, well, we're talking about your organizational maturity, but the actual maturity of processes which allow immature organizations to work with you as well. So there's a lattice frame of complexity that moves over that. I'll take that in terms of that kind of third party. We've talked already, Garrett, about the very much dictatorial view that you have, or your market has, in terms of what change looks like. But can you call out what the key change was? Obviously having third party to scrutinize what you're doing, but are there any other trends that you see that are coming down the track, that this is just a manifestation of it, what's more to come? Back to your point of the future is now. So what does the future look like for you?
Well, it is that, right? It is moving from various and ugly forms of self-attestation, which are at various levels of uselessness and complexity of lies, to be perfectly blunt. Whenever you're raising your hand saying, "I swear I take a shower every day and I have an awesome suit and a great haircut," believe me, we all know this, right? So the problem of self-attestation is not just a problem for us as it relates to our customers, but as we've been touching on in this call, it's also a problem for our suppliers, our supply chain, and their relationship to us. And it is one of the greatest issues. It's not a risk, because we're living the dream. It is one of the greatest issues that I think any company in any industry faces with suppliers that they use. Let's face it, especially the small ones, that their risk appetite, whether they're acknowledging it or not, is way high. And in most instances, it's too high. And they don't fully appreciate the liability and the potential impact of that really high risk appetite. And ironically, the correlation there is the higher your risk appetite, more than likely the lower you spend on things to keep you secure and compliant. The smaller organizations are not really in a great place to spend money on things. And one of the things that tends to suffer when you don't have proper staff log, when you don't have proper budgets, and so on and so forth, is process, because process can't be carried out unless you have the people to carry it out. So it's not just a matter of saying, well, I don't have a department to do that. No, yeah, you don't even have a person to do that. You don't even have a person's time slice to do that activity ever. And by the way, large companies still have this problem too. It's not like they're all doing the right thing. I think we know better than that. But that risk of supply chain downstream, I guess to use the parlance, as well as upstream, is where we are trying to focus, right? I see more things in the news about it wasn't my security posture or lack thereof that ended up getting me ransomware or ended up getting me filled with all this sensitive information or whatever. It was a supplier. And some of the biggest instances where there have been just voluminous data breaches have been because the supplier and their connection into our systems and our approach and the way we do things presented a risk because their posture was not where it needed to be, right? And it's not just suppliers, it's M&A activity, right? And most of us recall probably the Starwood incident with Marriott a while back. So that's the focus, but you got to have visibility into those third-party suppliers, and that's the existential 800-pound gorilla that's in the room. Right to audit is kind of a contractual fantasy. In about 95% of instances that I've seen, you just don't have the ability to truly peek behind the curtain and see what's going on there. So we're going to continue to struggle with this, and we're going to continue to grapple with this and try different approaches with this. But that's the future, just us trying to get a better handle on not only our own risk posture being externally validated, but that of our suppliers.
And I think that's testament to all industries that you represent, right? It is that the fullness of service delivery is only successful really now with a good reliance on the third parties to do so. So I suppose, Sid, to your experience within the markets, what's your view of how they are dealing with these particular problems?
Well, even before I get to how they're dealing with it, I think one key theme, I think Garrett mentioned this idea that you need to understand what your third parties are doing, but equally you need to understand what you're doing yourself. I think a lot of this is ultimately comes down to quantification and analysis. Quantification doesn't necessarily mean that you reduce everything to a number, or you say, here's my third-party risk number, it's 1.7 or 1.9 or whatever. But it does mean that you have an analytical approach. And our view is GRC generally, as well as third-party risk specifically, what you can't measure, you can't control. So if you really want to control the process, you need to start developing measurement mechanisms. And we're starting to see some of that already happen. I mean, I think Garrett mentioned about the idea of, digital third-party suppliers who are sort of coming in. And that's really chronic in financial services and to a lesser extent in energy. You have a whole new set of suppliers who are, maybe cloud-driven, new software suppliers who are, who you may have a whole value chain of providers who are linked on the cloud, if you will. They are much harder to understand, much harder to audit, much harder to figure out where and how their exposures are and where their risks are. But on the other hand, I mean, that's one side of the equation. It's a complex supply chain. Not all of it is visible, and so forth. But on the other hand, a lot of the cyber vulnerabilities and IT vulnerabilities, interestingly enough, are you can analyze them from an external standpoint. If you look at many of these cyber risk indexes or ratings, if you will, many of them actually give you a very interesting non-invasive view of the organization's internet hygiene or IT hygiene. They're not perfect and they're not a panacea, but for example, you have ratings from a wide range of vendors, including BitSight, ISS, etc., which provide you a score on how likely is a particular institution or internet endpoint, how likely is it to be breached, and so forth. So there's now a pretty broad range of ways and options of quantifying external and internal network risk, and not all of it requires you to have highly invasive access to your third party suppliers network, if you will. So in that sense, the options are increasingly available. We see ratings becoming increasingly standard, if anything more dictatorial, if you will. You need some form of cyber rating to start having linkages with the system. You need but we'll see a lot more of that, and I think in some ways, as organizations go on the cloud, beyond the more general public internet, etc., uh, non-invasive quantification methodologies will only get better over time, and we should be able to get not a perfect picture, but an interesting picture of the whole third-party ecosystems hygiene standards through you know uh, through ratings and through industry-based indices, comparison against those benchmarks, and various forms of other quantitative network analysis. So our view is that quantification and controls linked to quantification is the long term is the long term way. It's already manifested itself, but we think it'll get more systematic, more structured, and more prescriptive as we go along. As insurers start, and in many ways, it's not only the regulators who are the only drivers in both these industries. It's also the insurers. As the insurers start, both taking out policies on financial institutions' operations and start mandating certain degree of, they might mandate a certain rating of all suppliers that you have, and so forth. We'll see that as also a driver. But fundamentally, our view is the long-term solution to all of this is quantification of IT risks and delineation as well, because different types of IT risk have different issues. A breach versus attack on your data can be a slightly somewhat different dimensions. So different type of IT risks are different numbers, and so I think the theme will be that we'll be looking at different quantitative indices, different types of ratings, which will get more granular, more specific. But we've already seen basic industry-wide ratings from folks such as BitSight, ISS, etc., etc.
Thanks, Sid. Unfortunately, gentlemen, our time has come quickly to an end, but I just wanted to summarize some of the areas that we've talked about. I think the three key areas that I've noted from there's maturity on a number of levels in what's next, and I think that is an aspect that we are going to grapple with and be challenged by, because it's not just our own maturity, our own organization maturity, it's maturity of others. To pick up on Sid's final point there around quantification going forward, I think is critical in terms of how do we work our way through the if you can't measure it, then you can't control it type method. And I think that the way in which we see towards the future, that is evolving. And I also throw in, and particularly around if you like, the softer topics and the evolving topics around ESG, etc., is actually that idea of adoption and how and who is adopting that process. So going into the how do we comply as an adoption process going forward is again back to a maturity model. So three key things that I've taken away from that discussion. I think we could go on for a solid couple of hours with the amount of content there. So finally, thank you, gentlemen, for your input. It's been invaluable. I've thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. I hope our viewers have done so as well. And I will be handing it back to Almendina. And thank you again for your time.